We should make a start. That's 10 o'clock. Just before we start properly, to remind members of the committee that at the end of our formal meeting today we have a briefing from Scottish Government officials on their discussions with the HMRC about the Scottish rate of income tax. So hopefully get to that about 12:15. That's the plan anyway. So let's formally open this meeting, 15th meeting of Public Audit Committee for this session. Welcome to members, the public and any press who are here. Can I start by asking everyone to make sure that their mobile phones are switched off? We have apologies from Tavish Scott. That's all. And our first item is a decision on taking business in private, asking the committee to decide whether to take items 4, 5 and 6 on our agenda in private. Can we agree to that? Thank you very much. Which takes us to item 2, which is our continuing inquiry into the Section 23 report on managing ICT contracts. This morning we have with us from the Scottish Government the Accountable Officer Paul Gray, Director General Governance and Communities, along with Anne Moises, Chief Information Officer, Jane Morgan, who's Deputy Director of Digital Public Services, and Alistair Merrill, who's the Director of Procurement and Commercial for the Scottish Government. Mr Gray, you've submitted some written evidence, but I believe you'd like to introduce that to the committee this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide evidence on the Audit Scotland report about managing ICT contracts, the audit of 3 public sector programmes. I'll bring colleagues in as necessary on more detailed questions, but you've already introduced them. The Audit Scotland report is helpful and contains a number of recommendations which are in line with our current direction of travel. That's not to say that we can't learn from it, and indeed we have. As Accountable Officer for the Administration Budget, one of my responsibilities includes effective engagement with public bodies, and the recommendations on how we can better support public bodies are therefore very valuable to us. Of course, public bodies have their own chief executives and accountable officers, and I know that the committee has already taken evidence from Registers of Scotland and has seen other written evidence. So if the committee has detailed questions about specific organisations, then I'm happy to pursue these with the relevant accountable officer and to revert to the committee to ensure that I give an accurate response. But I do want to make absolutely clear to the committee that I accept that the Scottish Government has an important leadership role in responding to the Audit Scotland report. My written evidence sets out how we are responding to the recommendations. I'm not going to repeat that here, but I'm happy to expand on it. But I thought it would be helpful to explain to the committee briefly some other steps that I've taken since I submitted the evidence, and I can also expand on these if the committee would find that helpful. So firstly, I've written to Chief Executives of the relevant public bodies. That's not just the 3 covered by the report, but the range of agencies, NDPBs and non-ministerial departments, to ask them to ensure that the checklist that Audit Scotland has provided forms part of their regular assurance. Secondly, I'll be taking a report to the Scottish Government Strategic Board on lessons learned and actions on the 6th of December. I've met the Chair of the Scottish Government's Audit and Risk Committee to discuss our response to the Audit Scotland report. He's content with the actions taken so far, but I will be reporting formally to the Scottish Government Audit and Risk Committee on the 6th of December, immediately following the Strategic Board meeting that morning. Finally, on that, as part of our key supplier management approach, which is intended to enable a joined-up and pan-public sector approach when dealing with key suppliers, I met Brendan Dick, who's the Managing Director of BT Regions and the Director of BT Scotland, on the 26th of October. Brendan and I have met on a number of occasions to discuss BT's business with government, and at this most recent meeting, we agreed that I will attend for part of the meetings of the Board of BT Scotland on a regular basis to ensure that we maintain an appropriate relationship with a key supplier. The first of these meetings is scheduled for the 23rd of November, and this is consistent with the approach we're taking with other key suppliers too. As committee members will be aware, the Scottish Government recently published a national strategy document, Scotland's Digital Future, Delivery of public services. This document was developed with and for the wider public sector, and it aims to drive forward digital delivery of services, but also to ensure, in line with John McClelland's report of 2011, that we deploy ICT effectively. Just 2 points in closing. Aligned with this national strategy, the Strategic Corporate Services Board has overseen development of a linked digital public services strategy for central government. I'll now oversee implementation, and this includes some very specific actions we are taking to improve assurance processes for ICT investment by central government bodies. So finally, we've expanded the role of the Information Systems Investment Board as set out in my written evidence, and proposed investment from public bodies has been reported to that board. That board will seek assurance for higher risk projects that requirement in the Audit Scotland checklist are being met, and the Strategic Corporate Services Board will discuss the Information Systems Board's initial analysis and proposed next steps this afternoon. So we're taking this report seriously. We accept there's room for improvement. We're already taking steps to deliver that improvement, and the committee's comments and consideration will be helpful to us in informing our next steps. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Gray. Maybe I could kick off you. Said there in your remarks that the public bodies, like those three which the report focused on, although it did make clear that they were examples from many other public bodies who procured ICT, they all have their own chief executives and accountable officers. But you also acknowledged there that the Scottish Government has an overall leadership role. And certainly the report did suggest that the Scottish Government had been found wanting in that role. In paragraphs 53 to 56 in the Audit Scotland report, Audit Scotland say that each of the bodies, so each of the three bodies referred to in the report, approached the Scottish Government for advice or support. But certainly in two of those cases, that support was not really forthcoming. So in paragraph 55, it says that with regard to the PVG programme, they sought assistance from the Scottish Government, but were advised that assistance could not be provided within the timescale requested. And Registers of Scotland, although they provided periodic briefings to the Scottish Government, the Scottish Government didn't become involved or become directly involved in that ICT issue until late 2011, by which time the partnership approach had been in place for a number of years and the problems had become serious enough to lead in the end to the early termination of that contract. So could I ask why it was that the Scottish Government wasn't able to provide support to bodies like Registers of Scotland or Disclosure Scotland?
Well, if I start with Registers of Scotland, I think Anne Moises, who's with us here today, was in fact providing support to Registers of Scotland through the Gateway Review process. She sat on a number of Gateway Reviews, and in fact it was as a result of the RED assessment that the Registers of Scotland concluded that they ought to review the position in that particular contract. In terms of protecting vulnerable groups, if I can step forward and then step back. Stepping forward, the reason why we are taking through the Information Systems Investment Board and the Strategic Corporate Services Board a review of all the contracts and programmes that are in prospect is to ensure that if resources are needed, we're planning to put them in place. But if a public body comes up against a problem and asks for resource at very short notice, then the situation in the past is that we were not always able to provide that. We are not staffed to provide legal, technical, procurement support to every public body in Scotland. That is not to say we will not provide support, but what we're trying to do, and I think rightly, is to move to a situation where we're better able to plan the delivery of that support. It's also not the case that we will be providing that support directly from within Scottish Government. What we are proposing is that we will ensure that these organisations who need it have access to support from where it might best be delivered. That might be from the Scottish Government, that might be from elsewhere in the public sector, or it might be from the private sector. One of the things that's important in contracts of this type is that the costs include the costs of the necessary support, and that's one of the things we'll be looking at. So I am, Convener, very anxious not to come across as merely defensive and say that was the past and that is then and this is now. But I do want to convey that we're taking a more structured approach to this now because we think that's right. What I can't do, however, is cut across the accountable officer responsibilities that exist in individual organisations. I
mean, that relationship between Scottish Government and public bodies, I think, in the course of our investigations has been quite central to what happened, because much of the evidence that we've seen from those bodies involved, both written and oral, is that they didn't have within the organisations the expertise and capacity to procure these specialised contracts. But in the written evidence you've submitted for today, I must admit I'm still a little unsure about how you see that relationship. So, for example, you say our strategic review of current ICT skills availability within central government to identify gaps in the subsequent development of actions to address those, and so on. I'm not clear if when you say there within central government, if you mean within the Scottish Government or within the wider public sector, because certainly the evidence has been that something needs to be done to address this skills gap within public bodies like Registers of Scotland, Disclosure Scotland, and so on.
That's accurate, Convener, and we're looking, we're collecting at the moment, having started I think on the 1st of October, information about numbers across the wider cohort, and we'll link that with the work that we're doing on skills. Our intention is to look across the wider cohort, not simply within core Scottish Government, because what we are, as I've said, what we are not going to do is build up a massive pool of resource centrally, but rather make sure that it's distributed in the right way and shareable, so that resource might move about from time to time.
I mean, on that central resource, paragraph 78 of Audit Scotland's report says that in recent years the Information Services and Information Systems Directorate, which in the organogram you've provided does seem to be key to providing support where it's needed and where it can be provided, that the staff in that directorate has dropped from 300 to 200, so that's a drop of a third in their staffing. So, you know, what assurance can be given that the support that this directorate provides in future is going to be better than it was in the past, if they're trying to do that with 2/3 of the staff that they had, if they didn't have enough resource previously?
Well, three things. Firstly, I'm not suggesting that all the support that's required will come from Information Systems and Information Services Division. I think secondly, my intention is that we will build up expertise across the public sector which can be shared. So because what we're trying to do is avoid having a situation where we build up for the peaks and then when there are troughs we've got far too many people around. So we're adopting a much more shared approach. And thirdly, it would be dishonest of me to conceal from the committee the numbers of public servants are falling. I mean, that is what is happening, and therefore what we're trying to do is to look ahead so that we manage in the most effective way the support that is needed. The other thing I would say is that one of the things that we must increasingly build into the cost of contracts is the cost of the support that's required. So if the cost of a contract is simply focused on, or the cost of a programme is simply focused on, this is what it takes to put in an IT system, if you haven't costed in the legal advice, the procurement advice and so forth, then you've actually undercosted the programme. And that's one of the things we'll be looking at in the analysis of the information that I'll be seeing this afternoon.
That kind of suggests, doesn't it, that the savings from the reduction in staffing in the directorate at the centre, that at least some of those savings are actually being pushed out as additional costs to the public bodies who might have looked for support to the centre. either by having to provide that support themselves within their own cohort or by purchasing it from the private sector. So is that not a bit of a false saving then?
I think I think my answer is back to the point about peaks and troughs. I think we could staff up for the maximum demand, but if we did that, we would be at over capacity at times. I also think, I say this quite straightforwardly, I think we're not making best use of the range of expertise that we have in the public sector. We're not drawing it together as coherently as we could. And if we did that, I think we might well find that we could afford to do what we're planning to do within the cost envelope we've got. Sometimes what's needed is concerted support over 3 or 4 months, and that is what we provided, for example, for quite a number of months on the Protecting Vulnerable Groups programme. Sometimes what's actually needed is 2 or 3 days of expertise, and that 2 or 3 days can make all the difference and unlock the ideas, and that's the balance we're trying to strike.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, and can I thank you for the additional information that you sent to us this week, which I certainly found very helpful. Can I just first of all ask, I have no doubt that you read the transcript from 2 weeks ago. I personally felt that BT were pretty well being 100% blamed for what went wrong here. I'm pleased to hear that you will be attending BT board meetings, but I just wonder, was that an unfair assessment, or would you agree with the officials that gave evidence 2 weeks ago?
Well, I think the keeper of the registers, Sheena Adams, did try to make clear that they were not trying to blame BT for this. And in fact, I spoke to Sheena Adams this week in advance of my appearing here, and she repeated that point. If I may speak frankly to the committee, it may be that I'm growing in experience of coming to these committees. I'm not saying I'm good at it, but I'm learning to pick my words carefully.
If I may say.
Well, thank you, Ms Scanlon. I shall try to continue to be the straight man. So I think that it may be that someone who doesn't do this very often may not pick their words very carefully. I'm clear that Registers of Scotland took a loss over the contract. I am equally clear that BT did not secure the profit that they expected from this contract. I am clear that Registers of Scotland understand that they could have done things better. I'm equally clear, and I've discussed this with Brendan Dick, that there are things that BT feel they could have done better. That will often be the case when things go wrong. I think it is rarely completely one-sided, and I don't think it was completely one-sided here.
That's very helpful. I think that's a much more balanced view than we had last week. Can I just say that last week, 2 weeks ago, as a member of the committee, I was certainly given the impression that the 4 officials that gave evidence had nothing to do with the previous contract and they weren't in place at that time. However, when the contract started, back in 2004-05, I looked back to the annual report of the Registers of Scotland, and if I may just very briefly quote from the Corporate Governance Statement of Internal Control, ultimate responsibility for strategic risk management rests with the Management Board, based on the advice of the Audit Committee and operational groups, and where appropriate, taking external professional advice in relation to specific issues, for example, the development of the IT partnership. And I am satisfied that overall the registers are operating in accordance with Scottish Executive and Treasury guidance regarding internal controls and risk management, signed Sheena Adams, Managing Director. Were we misled 2 weeks ago? I was certainly of the impression that none of the officials had anything to do with the original contract and the review of that contract. This annual report, and she hasn't chosen her words, these words are written, page 43, 2005-06, was written by the person leading the evidence last week to say everything was under control. Were we misled?
I can't. I wouldn't say that, Ms. Scanlon. What I would say is that the red gateway assessment was in 2011, not in 2004-5. So it is fair to say, I believe, that Ms Adams would have been giving a fair and accurate view of the situation as it was in 2005. Had she been asked the same question in 2011, she may have given a different answer.
The problem was that there hadn't been a review for 6 or 7 years. What I read out to you was at the beginning of the whole process. And Ms Adams did state none of the current management team was in post in Ross in 2004.
She may not have been in post in 2004. She may have been in post by the time that the accounts were signed off. That information could be provided to the committee as a matter of accuracy. I know that it was around that time her predecessor left the organisation.
Whilst I welcome everything you've said and you've given us a statement to the convener, I also looked at the Civil Service Staff Survey for the Registers of Scotland. And if I can just say under the heading, I feel that Registers of Scotland as a whole is managed well. 3% of staff strongly agree and 11% agree. I feel that change is managed well, and my concern is that this is the organisation that should be fit for purpose to collect stamp duty and land registration. I feel that change is managed well in Registers of Scotland. 1% of staff strongly agree and 9% agree. Now, despite everything that you're doing, and I take that with the level of trust in which it's given, how can we, to me this points to a very demoralised workforce, how can we as an audit committee have the confidence that this organisation is managed well, it is fit for purpose, and it is adaptable to change because 1% of staff strongly agree that it's capable and 9% agree, leaving a huge 90% with not a lot of confidence in this organisation. What would your view be to this Civil Service Staff Survey, which appears to be well below the average for other public sector organisations?
I think on that point, Ms Scanlon, that is a point on which I would want to ask the Keeper to provide a view. I do not think that it would be either proper or helpful for me to provide this committee with my view of the management of the Registers of Scotland. I'm not the accountable officer for it, and I think it would be fair, if the committee has concerns in this area, to allow the accountable officer to give an account of herself, should she wish to, or the chief executive, should she wish to do so.
Would you agree that it is as appropriate that the staff feel change is managed well as all the measures that you're putting in place?
Well, I will speak for the Scottish Government. One of the areas where staff express concerns to us too is about the management of change. I think that staff do feel under considerable pressure because of the economic circumstances which everyone faces, the situation with pay and pensions, and that flows through into the feeling about how their place of work. I would say that senior managers across Scottish Government, and I can give you the assurance on behalf of the executive team and the strategic board, take change management very seriously indeed and recognise that having an engaged workforce is essential to good performance.
Right. My final question is, I think it was about 3 times last week we were told that lessons had been learned, and again I take that on trust. We were told about the success of the crofting register. However, the crofting register is not yet active. So, A, how can that be judged a success? And secondly, I've also had cause for concern about the 10 years that the Registers of Scotland have had to cleanse the land register of inappropriate burdens for the feudal tenure reforms. And I understand after 10 years, you know, the ICT that's being used, that this has not happened, and apparently there are now no plans, I understand this, to cleanse the register, and every day new and inappropriate burdens are being added. So I'm actually looking at the practicalities in the sense that we hope they can collect the taxes. The crofting register is not up and running. Have they successfully done everything under the feudal tenure reform acts that were passed by this Parliament over a decade ago?
I'm happy to get that information and provide it to the committee, Ms Scanlon. I understand the committee's legitimate concern in the functioning of registers of Scotland in terms of the duties and responsibilities currently laid on it and those duties and responsibilities which it may have to assume in future. I am content that the Keeper is taking this very seriously. I am content that they are putting steps in place, but I think assurance on the detail would have to come from them. I think it would be inappropriate of me to try to do that.
Thanks very much, Ms Scanlon. Mr Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Firstly, can I say that I welcome the submission by the Scottish Government and the indications of the review and so on that's taking place. Obviously, this is not going to be a small review. There is a cost attached to it. Is there a budget attached to that cost in terms of what's being proposed here?
Sorry. In terms of the review of the projects,
the reviews that you've indicated in your written submission.
Yes. In reviewing the projects in question, we're using mechanisms that already exist. So we're expanding the role and remit of the Information Systems Investment Board, and we're taking these the review of the projects within the scope of the Strategic Corporate Services Board. So what we're seeking to do is to make use of resource that already exists. If, however, the Strategic Corporate Services Board this afternoon concludes that there is insufficient resource available to do what is needed next, that is one of the things that we will say, and we will therefore ask the organisations concerned to review their costings to ensure that they have adequate provision for the support that they may need.
Just to still continue on the question of the review, perhaps looking at the scope of it, you know, there's sometimes surprises come out, and I wonder, you may or may not have this information available, are there any publicly funded bodies which are not included in this review and which you wouldn't be considering supporting from this perspective?
This review covers core public bodies, so it doesn't, for example, cover the NHS or local government. But if it was helpful to the committee, I could provide to the committee the list of the bodies to whom I wrote. I'd be very happy to do that. There are 54 of them from memory, so I'm not going to 52. Sorry, so that shows how good my memory is and why it would be better if I gave you the list.
It might be useful to know the scope there.
Yeah.
Last week also, when we were talking to Registers of Scotland, Mary Scanlon touched on the fact there that certainly Registers of Scotland obviously felt that you know, they got the fingers burned with BT, and the response seemed to be that in future they would deal with smaller contractors on the basis that Registers of Scotland wouldn't be bullied by the big boys, and maybe they could bully the little boys into doing better. Would you agree that perhaps there's a danger of an element of fragmentation there if you're dealing with a number of contractors, each doing their own little bit? There's always seems to be a danger to me in making it all join up, and you'll end up with them all pointing the finger at each other and saying, "Oh, it was you."
I'm going to give my colleague Alistair Merrill notice that I'm going to bring him in on this one, but I'll just make a couple of introductory comments, Mr. Beattie. The first thing to say is that using small contractors does not necessarily result in fragmentation. I've had experience of doing this where you've got a lead contractor who is contractually responsible, and that way there's someone there who is drawing together the pool of expertise. Secondly, I think it's worth saying at this stage that it's been suggested that John McClelland's report meant that we should simply consolidate everything with big suppliers. That is not either what John McClelland meant or what we are doing. One example will suffice. One of the reasons I'm working closely with BT is that we have a large number of contracts with them, let in different circumstances at different times. And it is actually more efficient for us and for BT to have some consolidation around that, so that we're not having multiple invoices and multiple rates of charge. Now, that's a prospect that we'll have to work towards. That is not to say we should therefore give everything to one big supplier. But Alistair will be able to say more to you about what we're doing to engage both with major suppliers but also with pools of small suppliers or individual small suppliers, depending on the needs of the particular organisation concerned, if that's all right, Convener.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, as Paul said, John McClelland, both his ICT report and his earlier report into public procurement, called for greater collaboration in letting contracts, but that does not mean giving contracts necessarily to single large suppliers. What it does mean is promoting the use of frameworks, and Registers of Scotland are using the IT Managed Services framework that Procurement Scotland put in place a year or so back. That is structured deliberately to allow both for large suppliers and for a range of SMEs to deliver IT services. And that framework was actually praised by John McClelland for the flexible approach it had taken to the lotting structure to make that facility available.
Mr. Dornan.
Before I ask my question, can I just go back to Mary Scanlon's contribution? My view last week was that ROS weren't blaming BT, they were blaming the contract. That they felt that the contract turned out to be not in anybody's best interest, and that they wouldn't want to go into a contract such as that again. But I didn't think it was basically that the BT were bad to work with. It's just the contract that was written at the time it was written wasn't for the benefit of either side. The fact that she was involved 2005-06 may well be that she came in at a stage where you don't know the details of how the contract was written, or see it working appropriately at that time and don't see what's coming down the pipe. So I just don't want us to go away thinking that, you know, ROS were just saying this is nothing to do with us, this was all about BT. And I don't have shares in it, so I'm quite happy to have a go at them. I know you don't, Mary. I know you don't. The question that and anyway, I do think that if there are a number of questions still to be asked by the Registers of Scotland, I think the best way to do it is either to write to them or to get them back in and ask some of the further questions that Mary mentioned. The question I did want to ask was in paragraph 70, we talk about the gateway and the lessons learned. But it seems that there's no mechanism to ensure that the learning's passed to all parts of central government, although they are passed to some parts of the Scottish Government. Are you doing anything to try and ensure that the lessons learned and best practice is spread out amongst all affected bodies?
Well, part of the function of the Strategic Corporate Services Board is to ensure that lessons learned are shared, but Alistair Merrill will be able to say in more detail how we disseminate lessons, because I think it's a very fair question.
Yes, I mean, Gateway is a well-established process both for providing project and programme assurance, but also making sure that the lessons are clearly learned within the organisations that are affected. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've taken steps to ensure that those lessons are more broadly disseminated. Committee members will be aware from the Audit Scotland report into major infrastructure projects that the Infrastructure Investment Board now regularly reviews the major infrastructure projects, and part of those reviews involve the lessons from the gateway reports that have been conducted. We are looking at applying a similar process within the Information Systems Investment Board to ensure that that captures lessons from, excuse me, from gateway reviews conducted on major ICT projects in the future. There are also a number of sort of checks that have been introduced to ensure that, particularly where gateway reviews identify potential problems, that the relevant accountable officers, the relevant SROs, and myself as the Scottish Government's Assurance Director are made aware of those recommendations, and I provide an annual report to the relevant audit committee within the Scottish Government that draws out any key themes from that.
Thank you. Just very briefly, you talked about it being rolled out among the information systems. Have you got a timeline for that?
Well, that I can come back to the committee on the timeline for that, but it's an intrinsic part of the developments that Paul Gray just outlined.
Mr. Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think in looking back on this particular problem with Registers of Scotland, I mean, the contract, as I understand it, was defined in 2004-5. So we could argue whether it's reasonable or not to expect within Scottish Executive or the current Scottish Government to be at the heart of providing IT support, expertise and support services to this public body, or indeed a range of public bodies. So where I think it becomes reasonable for committee members to express a view is that when things do go awry, there is a system in place to manage that and to make improvements so that we don't make those mistakes of the past. So I think to a certain extent, Convener, we're dealing with a kind of legacy IT issue that's pretty common, sadly, throughout the industry. And the problem, as I see it, is that if we don't have the expertise at the outset to define what it is we actually want, you end up getting what the vendor wants to give you. And I used the kind of silly analogy, Convener, of going into an electrical shop and thinking you're getting a washing machine, but you end up with a tumble dryer. That's what can happen to you if you don't specify at the outset clearly and spend the time at the beginning of a process to set out what your requirements are. So in the paper that you've submitted, Paul, I'm pleased to see various things in it, not least of which the engagement with BT, but the bit that talks about specification of needs at an early stage, and this is a common message, Convener, that we come back to several times in the Audit Committee, that there has to be a greater effort at the beginning of any project, whether we're procuring computer hardware or computer software and services, to be clearer about what it is we need at the beginning. And I think if that's the lesson that's learned, Convener, from the committee members' experience and Paul's team and their experience, I think we will progress. So what I'm asking Paul for is a clear indication that that is what's understood by the experience of this process, and the effort will be made, not just with Registers of Scotland, but other public bodies, to be clearer up front and early about what it is they actually need to deliver for the public.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. I mean, certainly one of the things that has been introduced, not just here, but the UK government as well, is extended the gateway process to a gate zero, which is intended not to be that sort of early review of assurance. And again, Alistair Merrill may be able to say a bit more about the detail of gate zero. I think you make a very fair point. It's important to be clear at the start what is required, and that's one of the things we will be looking at. Of course, I think it would also be right for me to say to the committee that if we do enter into a contract with an IT supplier which is long in its duration, IT systems, services and offerings change dramatically quite quickly. And therefore, what's also important is that the contract is sufficiently flexible to take account of changing opportunities that may arise. And that balance is not an easy one to strike. But being clear at the start about what's required how it will be delivered, preferably described on the basis of outcomes rather than of detailed technical specification, is, I think, the right way to get the best out of these contracts.
Yeah, can I just come back briefly on that? I mean, I do agree with that. I mean, if I can offer any bit of advice from my own experience in the software business, you spend...
As long as the software is free.
Aye, it's free, yeah. If you spend the time defining what the users actually want, and particularly when you're talking about software, convener, if you can see it running somewhere else for another customer, that is a great way of making your own mind up as an intelligent client or a potential user that what you're about to get is what you actually want. So the investment in time and effort at that phase of any project, software procurement project, will really yield dividends in the future, and I really hope that that kind of aspect would be embedded in your processes for the future, Mr. Gray.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, one of the things I'm certainly clear about is that the importance of building a little and testing a little to make sure that it's working as it's going along. If it's not too simple an analogy, the components of the replacement Forth crossing are being built in stages and they're being tested in stages. Nobody would think of building a bridge and then working out whether it worked when you put the first vehicle on it. That would not be the right way to do it. And we shouldn't build systems like that either.
Thank you very much. Ms White.
Thank you very much, Convener. Apologies for running in, I think, a second late anyway, and good morning. Can I just say from my own experience in the committee, I think it shows this committee and the inquiry that's going on just now, this committee at its best, and I think it's a credit to the Parliament that all the years down the line, 8 years, 9 years down the line, we're still looking at this and we're moving forward, hopefully. So I just wanted to put that on the record. There's three main issues that I wanted to raise. Mr Gray, you said at the beginning of your submission that costs include necessary support in contracts, and I just wondered if you could perhaps expand slightly on that. If support costs were included in the original contracts that Audit Scotland looked at, and if not, will they be included in future? I wanted to put on record also, I raised this at the last committee when we were talking about BT contract. The evidence we received was it wasn't necessarily the size of the companies, it was the length of the contract, which in some states was a problem. So it's not necessarily SMEs versus big contractors, it's the fact that someone can get a contract for 8 or 9 years with no get-out clause between them. I think that was one of the issues that was raised. And the third issue I wanted to raise was a follow-up from James Donan's question regarding Gateway and lessons learned. I noticed in your submission you mentioned the knowledge hub for Scotland's digital future. I just wondered if that would be a check and balance, and that would be part of the learning curve where you would monitor contracts. That was the three issues I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, in terms of costs, I think there will, of course, be programmes of ICT enabled delivery that the Strategic Corporate Services Board will review, which will have no external contractual element at all. And what I'm saying is that regardless of the nature of the programme, the cost of delivering that ought to include the anticipated cost of the support required to do so. So whether it's in relation to contractual and legal expertise, or whether it's in relation to IT and technical design expertise, or whether it's in relation to change management, these costs ought to be built into the cost of the programme, and we'll be looking to assure ourselves that that happens. On the interaction between the size of the contract and the size of the supplier and the length of the contract, that is not a simple issue. I'm going to turn to Alistair Merrill in a second, because one of the issues that we have to grapple with here is that if we want a supplier to help us to adopt a particular strategic direction of travel, then we have to have an engagement with them which is long enough to make it worth our while and worth their while in commercial terms. But on the other hand, in my response to Mr Coffey, I said IT does change pretty fast. And if you bind yourself into a contract that's for the delivery of a specific form of technology, then that can often be constraining. But, Convener, if it's all right, I'd like to invite Alistair Merrill.
Thank you. I mean, yes, a 10-year contract we would not normally now countenance. Since 2006, since the McClelland reforms of procurement took off, a huge amount of investment has gone in and effort has gone in to developing better tools, processes, and above all, better capability in relation to the management of procurement and the letting of contracts. We have, for example, the procurement journey, which is used across the public sector as an interactive means to help purchasing bodies decide on the best procurement process, but also on the best contract management process suitable for their needs. And that kind of support, that kind of toolkit, that kind of advice means that public bodies are in a much better place now to put in place correct contract management arrangements than they were back in 2004.
On the Knowledge Hub point, Convener, could I ask Jane Morgan just to say a little about that?
I think the Knowledge Hub essentially is for sharing information, for sharing lessons learned. I think your reference to, if you like, monitoring is something that relates more to the Information Systems Investment Board in looking at and seeking assurance on higher risk projects. So I don't think we should understand the Knowledge Hub to have that particular role.
Can I ask about the distinction between the two things here? Because presumably the Digital Public Services Programme Board is about delivery of public services through new technologies and access, whereas Information Systems Investment Board seems to be more about internal ICT and public bodies. But I must admit, the more I think about this, and I think about Disclosure Scotland and the impact on people trying to get PVG registration, or on the Crown Office and how that affected witnesses and others in the criminal justice system, or indeed Registers of Scotland, people trying to use the land register. The difference between the two, the more you think about it, seems to disappear. And so I wonder if in this structure, if it's a weakness that the Public Services Programme Board is kind of over here and the Information System Investment Board is over here. Are they not closer than that in reality?
I'll attempt. I think it's a fair point, Convener. I'll attempt to answer it by the Digital Public Services National Board is chaired by me. For my sins, I also chair the Central Government Strategic Corporate Services Board. So I'm responsible for the overall national strategy, and there is a board for health and a board for local government and a board for police and fire and so on, each with its own chair. So I chair the Central Government Sectoral Board as well as chairing the National Board. The Information Systems Investment Board reports to Barbara Allison, who's the Director of HR and Organisational Development. Anne Moises, Jane Morgan, Alistair Merrill are all members of that, and that reports into the Strategic Corporate Services Board. So we're trying to make a direct and linear link between the three to avoid that point of disconnection. We're considering, however, whether the membership of the Information Systems Investment Board should be broadened to bring in some further public sector bodies to be more representative, because we think that would help.
Okay, thanks. Yes, wait.
Thank you, Chair. I did want to follow up on the Knowledge Hub. And no, it's quite right, because it was similar to what I was going to raise myself. But in your submission, you mentioned about the Knowledge Hub site will ensure that public bodies are signposted to review lessons learned and contribute to the Knowledge Hub. Well, in my layman terms, and not being experienced in the Audit Committee so well, like the convener, if you're looking at lessons learned, where is that information going to go? Surely it would be better going to the top, to yourself, Mr Gray, if we're looking at lessons that's been learned previously. I just wondered if there is a duplication somewhere along the lines.
Well, first of all, I mean, the decision to implement the Knowledge Hub was taken by the board that I chair, and if there are key lessons, then I will expect these to come to the board. But what we're trying to do through the Knowledge Hub is to have something that will also allow individual experts to give more granular detail. So it won't just be about lessons that come out of gateway reviews at a very high level, but if there are particular local issues that arise that colleagues feel it would be helpful to share, then they will have the capacity to do that. At the moment, if somebody learned something and wanted to share it, they'd effectively have to find 50 or 60 email addresses, and it would be a different list each week, I've no doubt. So putting this in place where everyone knows that's where you can put the information and that's where you can go to. It's a service, but as Jane Morgan has said, I am not regarding it as part of our assurance mechanism. I'm not saying we've got a knowledge hub over there and therefore that's the assurance I need. The assurance will have to come through the formal governance structures.
Okay, thank you. You make me very glad, Mr Gray, that I only chair one committee. You chair so many boards that you must have trouble remembering which one you're chairing at any given moment. Ms Scanlon has a short follow-up.
Yes, it's really a follow-up to Willie Coffey's question, which I thought got to the heart of the matter. On page 19 of the Audit Scotland report, paragraph 77, and also the case study, Audit Scotland suggests the Scottish Government could look to the role of Major Projects Authority established by the Cabinet Office in England, not just to assess the viability before a project is initiated, but also to undergo regular and planned scrutiny. That seemed to be a reasonable suggestion from Audit Scotland, and I wonder, before doing what you've done and giving us this evidence and coming here today, have you been in touch with the Major Projects Authority in England?
Yes, we have, and in fact one of our senior director colleagues went through the most recent cohort of the major projects learning experience at a cost of, if my memory serves, about £30,000. I mean, we take this very seriously indeed, and we will learn from wherever we can learn from. Again, Alistair Merrill may want to say a bit more about the Major Projects Authority.
I mean, the Major Projects Authority works in a different way in England and Wales, taking a more proactive and central approach to managing the multi-billion-pound projects that are ongoing in England and Wales. The committee may recall that in response to the Audit Scotland report on major capital projects in Scotland, Alison Stafford, the DG Finance, set out the arrangements in place now to provide scrutiny for major infrastructure projects. We work closely with the Major Projects Authority, particularly in the ongoing development of gateway and associated integrated assurance tools, such as the Key Stage tool that the Scottish Futures Trust use. But it's also worth noting, perhaps, that the National Audit Office recently highlighted the resourcing challenge within the Major Projects Authority and the potential risk that it faces in living up to its aspirations to scrutinise the full quantum of major projects south of the border.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr Gray, we should probably finish by asking you the straight question that we've been alluding to all morning, which is, are you confident that the governance structure you've put in place makes instances such as the three that we've been studying as a result of this report significantly less likely in future?
Convener, I am, and I'm grateful to you for the phraseology significantly less likely. I cannot guarantee absolutely that nothing will ever go wrong again, but what we are doing does make it significantly less likely. And to pick up what I said to Mr Coffey, I'm applying to this the technique that I would suggest is applied to major ICT developments. We are building this, we are testing it, and if we need to refine it, we will refine it. This is not absolutely fixed. We'll learn as we go along.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much to your colleagues as well for your evidence this morning. Thank you. Right, colleagues, we're slightly ahead of schedule. We'll break till 11 and allow witnesses to change and allow me to Committee is reconvened, and we now turn to item 2 on our agenda, our second substantive item, which is the section 20, item 3, which is the section 23 report, NHS Financial Performance 2011-12, published by the Auditor General for Scotland, and we have the Auditor General with Angela Canning, Assistant Director, and Gemma Diamond, who is the Project Manager from the Performance Audit Group, to introduce this report. So I invite the Auditor General to introduce it.
Thank you, Convener. The NHS is one of our most valued public services, one that we all rely on at important times in their lives. And I should start by saying there have been big improvements in NHS financial management over recent years. It's also true, though, that the NHS is now facing significant financial pressures after a decade of growth, particularly in the face of continuing cost pressures and rising demand. The NHS has invested a great deal of work in its quality strategy, which is designed to help improve the quality of services for patients while responding to the financial pressures. But achieving this will be challenging and will require some difficult decisions in the years ahead. The aim of this report is to highlight the pressures faced by the NHS in continuing to provide quality healthcare for patients while meeting the financial challenges that it faces. In pulling the report together, we found that all 23 health boards in Scotland met their financial targets in 2011-12, and overall the NHS boards reported a small underspend against their £10.9 billion budget. This is a real achievement. However, it was achieved through a number of in-year movements in funds that are not clearly reported in boards' financial statements. For example, 3 NHS boards required additional financial support from the Scottish Government to break even, but a reader of their accounts would not easily be able to see that this report was required, the total amount received, and when the board will repay these funds. We're also concerned that the requirement for boards to break even each year can encourage a short-term focus, while changes to service delivery can take a number of years to put in place and may need upfront investment. The NHS therefore does need to increase its focus on longer-term financial planning as well as managing year on year. In the longer term, there are several big risks to boards' financial sustainability. 9 boards reported an underlying recurring deficit, relying on non-recurring funding to break even. And while boards made significant savings of £319 million in 2011-12, almost 4% of their baseline budget, they need to make further savings of £272 million in 2012-13 to break even. It's getting more difficult for boards to make recurring savings as they've already achieved the savings that are easiest to make. Boards have classified 20% of the proposed savings in 2012-13 as high risk, meaning that there is a higher level of uncertainty as to whether the savings will be realised in practice. To make significant savings in future, boards will need to reconsider their healthcare strategies and the potential for them to redesign services. Finally, the capital budget has decreased significantly, and boards are using their available funds for existing projects, meaning that there's little left over to address backlog maintenance or to invest in new ways of working, which might deliver services better and more efficiently. In the report, we make a number of recommendations to both the Scottish Government and to boards. In particular, we think that the requirement for boards to break even each year can encourage a short-term focus, and we think the Scottish Government should consider whether there are other options that would help to promote better long-term financial planning. Secondly, board annual accounts should be more transparent and clearly report how boards have achieved their end-of-year financial position, including details of any additional financial support required. And finally, the board's monthly returns to the Scottish Government on their financial position and their year-end forecasts could be improved, and the Scottish Government should ensure that boards are reporting their most accurate forecast position and that the means of reporting is consistent across the NHS. Convener, as always, the team and I are happy to answer questions.
Thanks very much. Maybe I could kick off with a kind of general question about the report. As the report says, and as you've indicated in your opening remarks, all 23 boards have met their financial targets. All of them have balanced their books, and also in the report you point to a number of improvements in accounting and transparency, some of which flow from the issue around, for example, the Western Isles, which I know the previous incarnation of the committee spent a lot of time dealing with. So that certainly seems to be very positive, and would characterise the report as good. But the report also points to, and you referred to most of these things as well in your opening remarks, a budget which is falling in real terms. It has been for some time. Achieving those balanced budgets using quite opaque movements of funds. And in 3 cases, that included relatively short-term loans on credit from the Scottish Government to get to that position, a £1 billion backlog in capital maintenance, and future plans, which the report describes on more than one occasion as high risk. That all sounds quite bad. And so I suppose my question is, how would you characterise this report? Is it a good report, or a bad report, or a good report with a warning attached?
Annual financial management is obviously very important for any public body, and it is genuinely an achievement for the NHS to have reached the position where all 23 health boards hit their revenue resource limits and capital resource limits in 2011-12. That wasn't the case in the past, and I would like to give credit to the NHS for the progress that's been made in doing that. However, we do feel that when you look beneath the surface of the efforts required by boards to hit their targets, some boards in particular found that very difficult to do. If you strip out the small number of boards which achieved surpluses, the overall remaining surplus is only 0.04% of the NHS budget, which suggests that people are coming in very tightly against a single point target in ways that don't encourage a longer-term focus on financial planning. And at the same time, we know things are going to be tougher in future than they have been since the advent of the Scottish Parliament, because of the decade of growth that we've seen, and now the pressures that will continue on both the finances available and the demands on the health service. I should clarify that we do say in the report that the territorial health boards will see a very small real terms increase in funding in 2012-13. There is a reduction in the funding available to the special health boards in the same year, and there's an important distinction between the two that I think is worth being clear about. In summary, I think I'd concur with your final classification of the report. The NHS has done well to achieve this position, but there are very significant challenges ahead in maintaining that for the future.
It's quite common in both management, in public and private sector, to use the kind of traffic light model. So what kind of warning is this? Is it an amber warning or a red warning? What's the kind of level of risk that you think the report's identifying?
I, again, would recognise all the work the NHS is doing to put in place the quality strategy to maintain the quality of services for patients while responding to the financial pressures. But the financial pressures are real and significant. And if you pushed me, I think I'd say this was an amber.
One aspect of it which you referred to there was giving credit to the health boards for balancing their budgets in year, but saying that in order to do that had required short-term measures which might jeopardise or undermine or make more difficult longer-term planning. It would seem perverse if Audit Scotland was saying for a public body to balance its books in year was a bad thing. So I just wonder what it is you're suggesting would be a more effective system which would allow longer-term planning.
You're quite right. One of the reasons why I'm so careful to say that achieving financial balance in year is important is that if any board fails to do that, I'm required to qualify their accounts. So it would be perverse of me to criticise them for doing it. I think there are two challenges within there. First of all, simply the fact that the financial regime does require that very precise hitting a revenue resource limit and a capital resource limit every year can get in the way of the longer term changes that are needed to really transform services for the future, to be able to meet all of our expectations and demands within limited resources. And secondly, that the way in which that's done isn't transparent in the accounts of the boards themselves. I am a strong believer that transparency in financial and performance reporting is very important for trust in public services. The IMF produced a very good report on fiscal sustainability last year, which made the same point, that transparency is important for good decision making. And it's not clear in boards' annual accounts at the moment the measures which they're having to resort to achieve financial balance where that's the case.
Do you think it would be better if they were required to balance their books over, say, a 3-year period rather than annually? And would it make more sense if where they were shifting resources from one year to another in order to balance their books, they could do that without returning funds to the Scottish Government and then having to ask for them back, which seems to be essentially what's happening here?
We deliberately haven't recommended a specific set of changes, in part because the financial framework is at the moment driven by Treasury requirements for all public bodies across the UK. There may be some merit in looking at whether that framework can evolve to meet the requirements now of financial management, or indeed whether there are mechanisms that would let boards develop surpluses for specific purposes, which they can then use to reinvest in service transformation in future. And we'd be keen to hear the Scottish Government's thoughts on how that might evolve. But greater transparency would also help in letting us all see how far those movements are affecting boards as they strive to hit their targets at the year end.
Thanks very much. Ms. Cameron.
Thank you. I just have two questions, and they both relate to risk. And the first one would be Exhibit 8 on page 16. And what does, savings required, if I can just look at, obviously, NHS Highland, 23 million, percentage high risk, 13%, Lothian, 62% high risk, Shetland 44% high risk, and NHS 24-45, and the ambulance service, who I think struggle to meet the demands on their service, 25% of their savings are high risk. What do you mean by high risk in terms of patient care?
I'll ask Gemma to talk to you about that in more detail. In broad terms, the categorisation here is the categorisation used by the boards themselves in their financial plans for this financial year, 12-13. And it's important to be clear that they don't reflect directly any risk to patients. They reflect the risk that the savings won't be achieved in practice. Gemma, can you give us a bit more detail?
Absolutely. In their local delivery plans, when the board sets out the savings that they're required to make in the next year, they have to categorise the savings into three different categories: low, medium and high risk. And that essentially tells a story of how hard it is going to be for them to find those savings. So those in the higher risk category will be harder to achieve. For example, we also raised the issue in the report that some boards classify some of their risks as unidentified, which means that they haven't essentially yet got a plan in place to identify where those risks are going to come from. And commonly, boards will also classify those unidentified risks as high risk, because as there's no plan in place, they are a high risk of not being achieved.
So high risk is in relation to the financial performance, which obviously could impact on patient care. I'll maybe come back to that, but others then. The other one concerning risk is one that I've mentioned in the past. I was amazed that the estimated backlog of maintenance is now over £1 billion. It doesn't seem that long ago when it was about half of that. Now, when we're talking about backlog maintenance, maintenance, is that absolutely desirable, essential, critical maintenance that is necessary to achieve health and safety standards and ensure that patients aren't at risk? Or is that desirable maintenance? I'm not trying to be flippant, but I do think it's important to categorise this backlog maintenance. Is that maintenance that is required to meet health and safety standards and ensure patients are at risk, the whole £1 billion?
The short answer is that it's a whole range of maintenance requirements in different settings and of different types. Again, I'll ask Gemma to talk you through the way the figures derived.
This was actually work that was done by the Scottish Government themselves. They produced a report on backlog maintenance and the assets of the NHS Scotland estate, which was published back in January of this year, and that came up with the figure of £1 billion, which is the current level of backlog maintenance. Now, they did a lot of work within that report to categorise the risks associated with different areas of backlog maintenance, and it might be worth asking questions of the Scottish Government about how they've taken that forward, because that's certainly the latest position was at January 2012.
There was information in the past, and I can't remember if it was Audit Scotland, but there was a category or a percentage of maintenance, I don't remember where I saw it, that was essential maintenance required to meet health and safety standards. So what you're saying is that's not broken down here, but it's here somewhere.
It's not broken down in the figure as we've reported it. What we've done is take the assessment carried out by Scottish Government at January this year and reported as the total requirement. I think the figure that you're remembering is probably one that came from a wider report of asset management carried out by Audit Scotland in the past. And we would expect the Scottish Government itself to be taking this figure further in terms of planning what's required and over what timescale.
So the Scottish Government would have that figure. Thank you.
So.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Convener. It's again on that point of a £1 billion maintenance backlog. It certainly would give the impression that we've got a crumbling NHS estate in Scotland. And I know that you've pointed out that those figures have come from a Scottish Government report, but it was just to ask if you have any indication of how quickly or how fast that backlog is rising. When was there any previous assessment done, and sort of what timescales you have there?
Gemma, can you help with that?
I think this was certainly a very comprehensive assessment by the Scottish Government. In terms of timescales as to how quickly it's accelerating or when it will be addressed, I think that differs from board to board and the properties that they own. We know that at some boards there are projects in train which will address some of the backlog maintenance. So, for example, building a new health centre will take away a portion of the backlog maintenance when the old building is disposed of. So we know that it is different for different boards according to their own property strategy.
I think how quickly the backlog is rising is going to be key to whether the NHS actually have the ability to tackle it at all. The capital budget they have at the moment, the government are moving £320 million from revenue to capital. That's for some existing projects that are there. It was just on the point of boards who go over their budgets and then borrow from the government are now being allowed to repay that borrowing through their capital budgets. Do you not feel that's a bit counterintuitive? Moving resource from revenue to capital in one sense, and then in another sense when it comes to borrowing, moving resource from capital to revenue?
I don't think there's a straight yes or no answer to that. If you've got a budget as big and complex as that of the NHS, I think it is reasonable to look at the best use of the resource you've got in any one year and over the planning period in general. I do think, however, that there's a strong case for greater transparency about it, so that it's clear whether problems are being stored up for the future by using, for example, a capital receipt to cover revenue expenditure or to repay funding that was provided for revenue purposes. And at the moment, that transparency, we think, could be improved in boards' annual accounts.
I think when it comes to the using of a capital receipt to cover up for a revenue overspend, capital receipts at the moment come to the NHS nationally, and there's national priorities dictate where that capital receipt is spent. But now we have a position where territorial boards now have control over that capital receipt to cover up their overspend, and that national directive isn't able to be given that you would normally expect.
I think Scottish Government approval is required to use it in that way. And as I say, I think within the overall system that there may be instances where that is a good use of a receipt. What our concern is that it's not transparent that's the case in ways that would let us make that judgment about the relative priorities between capital and revenue and between particular projects on both streams of expenditure. The transparency for me is the most important issue to get right to start with, that lets all of us make judgments about how well the money is being used.
Okay, thanks. Just a small point of clarification related to that to do with transfers between revenue and capital. Paragraph 58 says 6 boards transferred revenue funding during the year to support £7.16 million of capital spending, and the next paragraph says NHS Lanarkshire transferred £3.65 million from revenue, partly to help address the maintenance backlog at Monklands General. Are those two part of the same figure? In other words, is half of that £7.16 million attributable entirely to one board making that single transfer?
Yes, essentially that's right. The 3.65 billion is included within that 7.16 million.
Mr. Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, my overall impression of this report is a positive one in the face of the challenges, obviously, with the substantial cuts that the Scottish Government overall is having to deal with. There's one or two points here perhaps I can ask about. Touching on a point that the convener raised earlier on in connection with NHS boards and the reserves. I'm looking at paragraph 16 here, and it states here, unlike other parts of the public sector, NHS boards cannot build up reserves from year-end surpluses to support future investment in services. Is the NHS unique in this, in the public sector? And this may not be a question you can answer, but is there a historic reason for that? I'm just curious.
It's not unique in it. Other public bodies operate under the same financial regime, but because of the size and scale of the NHS and the particular nature of its services that respond to demand, we think it's a particular issue for the NHS. Local government bodies particularly are able to build up reserves because of their slightly greater distance from the Scottish Government core. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the second half of your question, Mr. Beattie.
Firstly, I was asking whether it was unique in this,
yep,
and whether there were other areas of in the public sector that had the same strictures.
Yes, there are other parts of the public sector that have the same strictures, but they're not as significant in terms of either the size of spend they're responsible for or the pressures on their finances as the NHS is.
I think I also asked about whether there was any historic reason for it that you knew of.
I'm not aware of the historic reasoning behind it, other than that it is part of the Treasury framework for financial reporting and audit, which takes this approach to having annual targets for revenue and capital limits.
Turning to paragraph 34, I noticed that you state here, the auditor has highlighted the need for strong leadership and direction in achieving this plan. By putting that in, it sort of implies that strong leadership and direction isn't there, or wasn't at the time that the audit took place, and I would ask if that is so, and if we're aware that has been rectified since.
I think this is very much a live issue at the moment. The report that we are quoting from here was finalised at the end of July by the auditor of the Special Health Board in question. And I think you're right, the fact that the recommendation was made, or the finding was made, suggests a degree of concern about the board's ability to respond to the challenges it faces. It will be absolutely part of the auditor's work in this financial year and the report that I'll receive next summer on their performance. And as we say throughout the report, we hope that the Scottish Government is also monitoring progress in this board as part of its monthly monitoring returns.
So at this particular point, we don't really know if this has been rectified?
At this stage, not. This is the position as at the end of July 2012, so it's as up to date as we have just now.
Okay. Turning to paragraph 62, there's reference here to PFI charges, which obviously, are a historic millstone round the NHS's neck. You state here that primarily the increases were caused by NHS Forth Valley and NHS Fife with the completion of new PFI projects. Just from information, my understanding is that with most PFI contracts there is an inflation factor built in. Do we know what the impact of that inflation factor is across the NHS?
I don't have the figure here at the moment, I don't think, and I suspect the team won't have it either. The figure is available and we can come back to you with that.
I'd be interested to know that, because you know, that increase is going to be with us year on year, regardless of how much budget is allocated to the NHS. That's going to be a constant drain.
One of the factors that my predecessor as Auditor General has reported on is the longer term impact of PFI charges against the backdrop of the spending review figures that we know are here in Scotland and the likely figures thereafter. So we can give you some information from that reporting after the meeting, Mr Beattie.
In the light of what you're saying there, do we have a projection for the NHS for what the PFI charges are going to be, taking into account notional inflation factor?
Yes, I think those figures are available. I think we've reported them in the past, and I'm sure the Scottish Government has them, so we can provide you with that.
Thank you.
Just on that, although those will increase in terms of inflation, and most of those referred to in paragraph 62 are historical, is it not the case that the completion of NPD projects will increase that budget line as well, because they will similarly have to be supported from revenue?
Absolutely. Effectively, any way of funding capital other than a one-off capital allocation has got long-term revenue consequences, whether it's PFI, NPD, or for other parts of the public sector direct borrowing, there's a revenue consequence. So that's one of the challenges around the capital and maintenance backlog which exists, that any way of resolving it does have an impact on capital budgets in the long term.
So a year from now, those increases, instead of being down to completion of the Forth Valley and NHS 5 projects, will increase as a result of the completion of the Stracathro and Murray Royal projects, because they'll feed through into that revenue line.
And any other new capital projects that are funded through NPD mechanisms.
Thank you. Ms White.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning. I think it's an excellent report. It raises some questions, obviously, and that's what the Audit Committee is here for. And one of the things I very much strongly agree with you, and Mark Griffin's picked up, is about the transparency. And obviously, my colleague Colin Beattie had mentioned the PFI contracts as well. I think it's important that we do have complete transparency in reports, particularly, you know, paragraph 24, where, you know, obviously hospitals, you can get money from the Scottish Government or NHS boards, but you can't actually follow that through in a report. There's no trail, as might be said. So I absolutely agree with you on that, and we'd hope they would take that particular point on board. When I'm talking about transparency also, and you mentioned maintenance backlog, in reports, do hospitals or NHS boards put forward any assets which they are shedding? And I'll give you the example of in my own area in Glasgow. Basically, there's York Hill Children's Hospital, fantastic asset which will be sold off. The Western Infirmary, fantastic land asset as well, which will be sold off. There'll be lots of money coming into Greater Glasgow Health Board in that context. In the transparency aspect of it, would these be expected to be put into a report of they're looking to sell these assets off and how much they may gain from them?
I agree with you. That's a very important aspect of transparency. I'll ask Gemma to talk you through how those sorts of transactions are accounted for and any wider reporting that's relevant.
If a board is holding any asset which they have formally declared as surplus, then that has to be recorded as such in the accounts, and you would see it in the asset statement as being formally declared as surplus. But that means that a board decision has to be made, essentially, that it is surplus. And you would expect to see the proceeds from that asset sale coming through in future financial statements. But obviously, as we've talked about before, the regime for capital receipts is that the board only essentially gets to keep what that asset has been valued at, and any profit element gets returned to the Scottish Government for use in the wider capital budget, so it can essentially be used across the NHS.
Thank you. I just wondered, you're talking about surplus and the board, you know, putting this forward. Is there a time scale for that? You know, is it in 1 year, 2 years? Where, I mean, I know that the situation at the moment is much more difficult to sell property, etc. But these properties have been looked at for the last 5, 6, 7 years, and it's going to come on stream pretty quickly for the York Hill site. Is there a time scale when they would advertise it and know that they'd sold it? is there any timescale there, or can it languish for a number of years as an empty building and would be included in the maintenance, perhaps, part of, properties?
I think it all depends for each individual board as to when the actual formal decision is made that these assets are surplus to requirements, and therefore the timetable then for how they're going to best dispose of the assets and when the timing of that disposal would be. I'm not honestly sure whether there's any timescales around that, but we can certainly look into it and come back to the committee if that would be helpful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That would be excellent. I've been trying to find out myself, so perhaps you'd be able to do that work for me. Can I just touch on a slightly different aspect, Chair? Thank you. In your submission, you mentioned about healthcare strategies, and you need to redesign. Obviously, health boards would need to redesign their healthcare strategies. Would the health and social care, working together, would that be part of the redesigning? Which obviously, I think most people think that's a better thing, that the health and social care is together, and through that you would assume that money would be saved that we'd be able to put into the health service. Would that be one of the issues you were raising regarding healthcare strategies being redesigned?
At the highest level, I think it's a great example of that. The focus for health and social care integration initially is about services for older people. At the moment, we know that a significant part of the pressure on the health service comes not just from the fact of the population ageing, that we're all getting older and we use more health services as we do so, but that there is a particular group of older people who account for a lot of emergency admissions and repeated emergency admissions, which aren't good care for them, but also have a big impact on the rest of the services in the hospital. Now, the health service could already be doing a lot to redesign services to help keep older people out of hospital by working more closely with social care and primary care, and to make sure that if people are admitted, they're discharged safely to the right setting that will be a safe and high quality level of care for them for the future. But doing that will often need investment, perhaps in new buildings like community hospitals, perhaps in new ways of staffing services. And it's exactly that sort of area where we have a concern that the focus on hitting the short-term annual target can get in the way of investing in the longer-term changes that are needed for better health and care services for the long term for all of us.
Thank you, Kavira. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Coffey.
Timing, Convener, thank you. Good morning to the Auditor General. Could I turn your attention, please, to Exhibit 9, which deals with staffing numbers within the service and looks back from 2009 to the present. I note to the Auditor General's comments there that some of the biggest decrease in staffing over the NHS is really in administrative staff. That's reported in Exhibit 9 there. And I do note the drop in the numbers in nursing and midwifery, but that seems to be more than compensated for by personal and social care staff numbers going up considerably by about 130%. The recurring savings that the boards are making, Auditor General, you also attribute to, in some part, to the voluntary severance schemes that are in place and so on and so forth. Is what we're seeing here the board's beginning to shape the future in the way that you perhaps alluded to when the convener opened his remarks? You were talking about the annual budget planning and so on and reporting annually, and there was a suggestion certainly from the convener that I picked up that would perhaps, and yourself, that would perhaps be better done over a longer period of time. Are you seeing from your reports here with these variations in numbers, the board's beginning to apply their own needs to their own particular circumstances in their own areas to deliver the kind of service that we expect of them?
I think it's too early for us to say that. I'll make a couple of points before I ask Angela to come in and amplify in response to your question. The first thing to say is that the reductions in staffing we're seeing in the health service are smaller than we're seeing in the rest of the public sector. For a whole range of reasons, but I suspect primary among them is the fact that the NHS is demand-led and has to be able to respond to the services, to the people who pitch up needing healthcare, as all of us would expect, and also the difficulty of really reshaping services in ways that can look like a loss of services to people locally who tend to be very attached to hospitals as buildings, rather than the services that are delivered in a range of different ways. We also know that within the NHS there are some significant constraints that can make it harder to reshape staffing, such as requirements around medical training and medical staffing requirements. Angela may be able to help with a bit more information about that.
Yeah, I think just picking up on your point, I think we do know that there are changing roles within the workforce. You know, like nursing staff taking on additional tasks that might have been done in primary care by GPs and in hospitals as well. I suppose one of the things to emphasise is that all of this should be done with the boards having an eye on good sound workforce planning. So it's not just about making voluntary severance schemes, reducing staff numbers, but looking at the shape of the workforce, building that into their workforce planning, and making sure they've got the right staff in the right place to deliver quality services.
We're just kicking off a big piece of work on that at the moment across the public sector, and NHS workforce planning will be a significant part of that, so we should be able to give you better information next year.
That. Is that kind of those kind of variations in what we can see in Exhibit 9, are they also happening on a kind of annual rotational basis, or is there a long-term plan behind that? It's easy to jump to conclusions, convener, and say, oh my goodness, there's a drop in number of staff there, but it's hugely compensated for by other categories in this table here. So I'm wondering if that is by design, and whether that is over a longer period of, say, 3-5 years, or is it an annual picture and we'll see a completely different picture next year?
We can't answer that until we do the audit that we've just started of workforce planning, but there is always a concern that if you're relying on voluntary severance, you don't have as much control as you would like about which members of staff and which groups of staff are accepting the opportunity to leave the service early. So at this stage, it's certainly too early to say that this reflects a planned reduction or a planned reshaping of the workforce, and we'll be reporting back to you on that next year.
Okay, thanks. Ms Scanlon has a follow-up.
Yes, sorry, it's just that I feel that this relates to NHS Highlands, so apologies for being parochial. But I mean, am I right in saying that there has been a decrease in nursing and midwifery staff from 2009 to March this year of 2,000? And also the increase in personal and social care staff, that's up 160, but in actual fact there are no new people employed. The home care staff that were employed by Highland Council now work for NHS Highland, and in the footnote at the bottom of the page it's 835. So in essence there's actually 600 less staff. It's just that I'm very familiar with NHS Highland being the lead agency now, so although they have more staff, it's not that more people are employed, they've changed employers under 2P regulations, but that still leaves a 2,000 reduction in nursing staff. Have I got that right?
I'll ask Gemma just to confirm the interpretation of the figures, if I may.
Yes, that is right. Essentially, there's a large jump in the number of personal social care employees due to that transfer between Highland Council and NHS Highland, and that is the only area that was affected by that transfer.
Yes, but it's not new jobs.
No.
It's simply a different employer. Thank you. And whilst the convener has kindly let me in, paragraph 58, given that we've spent most of the morning looking at ICT contracts, there is a point here that I do find concern, and I do think there are underlying concerns in this report, but it's the final sentence in paragraph 58. There is also a risk that the investment needed to maintain and develop the clinical estate, equipment and ICT will be unaffordable. That would be a cause of serious concern if the NHS could not afford to invest in technology and equipment which eventually would save money and would undoubtedly benefit patient care. Is that... You've not given a lot of emphasis to that, but do you find that as a serious concern moving forward for the NHS?
It's certainly one of the reasons why we've reported on the NHS finances in the way we have this year. Ms Scanlon will recall that we've reported in the past on telehealth, for example, which is a great example of the way you can make an investment in IT and both save money, but more importantly, improve the quality of care. At the moment, we don't have evidence of boards being unable to move forward with investments they would like to make because of a lack of capital. We are intending to collect more information about that during this financial year and to be able to report back to you on it at the end of 12-13 as we get a clearer picture.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Mr Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. My question relates to paragraph 50, the equal pay claims that may affect the financial position in the future. Obviously, this is a very, very long-running saga. And I noticed from this paragraph that the ending of this is still less than clear as to what effect it's going to have on boards. And I was wondering if you had a better idea of when we're likely to have some sort of conclusion, and if possible, give us an idea of how drastic the effect could be if things don't go in a positive fashion.
In terms of when it might be resolved, I'm afraid we're not really able to help you, and it is a source of some frustration that it's taking such a long time to quantify what the likely cost and impact might be. Members of the committee may be aware that there was a landmark ruling in relation to local government equal pay claims last week, which will help to give greater certainty about the liabilities in that part of the public sector. My understanding is that doesn't help to move us on very far in relation to NHS equal pay claims. If I may, I'll ask Angela or Gemma to give us a bit more information about that. Gemma, we're looking at you again, I'm afraid.
Essentially, at the moment, we don't really have any more information. The Scottish Government, Health Boards and Audit Scotland are all working together quite closely on this to try and move the situation forward. But essentially, it's because there's a number of test cases going through the courts, and that is why the liability has reduced somewhat because of the outcome of these test cases. But certainly at the moment, the boards have not been able to put a figure on the potential liability. Therefore, there's no figures in the accounts. It's an unquantified contingent liability. There's a risk that they may have to pay out in the future, but we don't know anything about the quantity, and the timing is still quite uncertain as well.
The reason why we think it's a less significant issue in the NHS than in local government is because it relates to a very specific period between the dissolution of NHS trusts and the implementation of Agenda for Change. The best information that we have is that there are around 10,000 outstanding claims in the NHS in Scotland, but the Central Legal Office would be better able to give you information about the work they're doing to bring those to a conclusion.
Okay. Mr Dornan.
Thanks very much, Convener. I welcome the report. I think it's very positive in the main. Clearly there are a couple of issues, but I'd like to touch on the financial assistance for the 3 health boards that were talked about earlier on. Is it not true, for example, that 2 of these had new hospital builds, which would obviously mean that they had specific financial pressures at that time, and also that this money isn't given unless there's an arrangement for these boards to go back into not profit, but to be able to run steadily again in the near future. And on that, could you tell me what the projections are for these 3 boards in financial terms for this year?
It's certainly true that the Scottish Government only provides additional financial support to boards when it has agreed a plan for how that support will be repaid, either in the immediately following financial year or over a period. And it's also true that both NHS Forth Valley and NHS Fife had new hospitals coming on stream. We weren't able to determine whether the cost pressures of the new hospitals, and particularly the transition to the new hospitals, had been as foreseen in the financial planning that the boards had done with the Scottish Government, or if there were unexpected pressures that happened because of timing, either of the move or of capital receipts. So there was a bit of a lack of transparency there that we weren't able to underpin. Gemma may be able to give us more information about what the plans are for repayment in all 3 cases.
Certainly, when these offers of financial support are made between the Scottish Government and the boards, it's certainly the case that they put in place a plan to be able to repay the funds and work out the best repayment plan for those funds. With the example of Forth Valley, that repayment plan is going to be timed around when they get in receipts from the property developer. All three boards have forecast for 2012-13 to be in recurring financial balance within this year. So that's certainly something that I know the Scottish Government will be looking at, and will be looking at through our audit process to make sure that that certainly is the case, or whether they have any problems along the way. So we'll be keeping an eye on that through the process. They are all scheduled to start making repayments on the financial support that they received in this year as well. So that will be an additional pressure that they have to work into their financial plans to make sure that they can meet those repayments.
Just follow to that, can you confirm that the amount that was loaned, if we want to use that word, was minuscule? It was 0.1% or something of the annual NHS budget, and also that this veering of money is not unusual and is actually something that was agreed by this committee some time ago.
Exhibit 5 sets out the amount of support provided to all three boards together with the repayment schedule. That's on pages 10 and 11 of the report. The amounts involved are relatively small in relation to the overall NHS budget, which is, as you know, is very significant, 10.9 billion for the territorial health boards. And it has been used in the past, and our concern is not about the ability of the NHS to work together to manage its finances. As I said at the beginning, I think that's a good thing. Our concern is, first of all, that it appears to be getting more difficult for some boards to achieve their financial targets, and that it's not transparent in the accounts what support has been received, how it's being used, and when it will be repaid. So we hope this report's a useful contribution to that debate, and the challenge for us is really about making sure that the financial management is helping to achieve the long-term transformation that's needed, given the pressure on resources that all public services are facing and the particular demand pressures that face the NHS.
I appreciate it wasn't you that was making claims. It was more one of the national newspapers that was suggesting that this was something unusual and something very difficult for people to deal with. Okay, well, thanks very much for that. Appreciate that.
Mr Griffin, do you want some small?
Yeah, just a quick point on Exhibit 11 on page 21. You identify the highest earning, the role and the band of pay. So just to ask about the variances there. I mean, looking at Ayrshire and Arran, at a band of 210 to 215,000 compared to Lanarkshire and Mourne region of 105 to 160 for a health board. I mean, Lanarkshire has a higher budget than Ayrshire and Arran, and yet the highest earner is earning significantly lower. It was just to ask if there's any reason for that, or if there's any national direction given on pay. Any comments on that?
I think there are three things which affect the pay of senior managers in the NHS, and particularly of medical directors. The first is a link with the size and complexity of the board. The second is the length of time the person has been in post, and therefore the progression which they've made over that time. And the third, particularly for medical directors, is the distinction award system, which can have a very significant effect on consultants' salaries. I can't comment on the specifics, but they're the three things which have an impact on the pay levels for senior managers and medical directors in the NHS.
Okay, thank you. It was much remiss of me not to welcome Jackie Bailey to the committee. So I apologise to Jackie for that, but I don't know if she wants to ask anything.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for the committee's time. I do have a couple of questions, if I may. I think there was some helpful clarification sought by Mary Scanlon on the fact that the reduction in nurses line in table, I forget where it was, on staffing. The table 9.
Exhibit 9.
It was Exhibit 9, that the reduction in nurses line isn't compensated for by the personal and social care staff line. And on that basis, given that nurses and midwives, whether they are in hospital settings or community settings, if described as nurses and midwives accounted in that line, would you comment on whether the boards were highlighting a further decline in those numbers, and what percentage or what number did you arrive at that we would be facing in the future?
I'm not sure at what point in the session you came in, Ms Bailey, so apologies if I'm repeating things you heard earlier. At this stage, we don't have clear figures about the future direction of staffing numbers for either clinical staff or non-clinical staff, but we have just started a significant performance audit which is looking at managing workforce reductions across the public sector, and our aim is very much to look at what plans people have in place to manage within the financial constraints for the future, and to make sure they're doing that in a way which is really designed at maintaining the quality of service and the shape of services that will be required in the longer term as well.
Yeah, I very much welcome that report when it emerges. It's certainly the case that the perception we have, and from board papers, that there is to be a continuing decline, particularly in nursing and midwifery numbers. Is that your experience?
I can't comment on the specifics, but it's certainly clear that within the spending review targets that we're seeing right across the public sector, there is likely to need to be a further reduction in the number of staff employed right across the public sector, and our interest in how that's being achieved, to make sure that the opportunity is also being taken to transform service delivery rather than simply to salami slice numbers in ways that would be risky to the quality of service provided.
John, I think that's an ambition we would share. Can I come on to the voluntary severance package as the flip side of that discussion? I know you say it accounted for 20.8 million and that the average package was 45,000 amongst about 400 people. I wonder whether you made an assessment not just of the higher levels of management that were exiting with voluntary severance packages, but what was the kind of average package for those who are more appropriately described as frontline staff? And does this include compromise agreements that health boards were arriving at, or is that measured somehow separately?
I will start off and then ask Angela and Gemma to come in to amplify my response. First of all, the information we're reporting here comes from NHS Board's own annual reports. The disclosures they're required to make now about both remuneration and voluntary severance packages and compulsory severance packages where they're an issue, and they're not this year, is required to come through in their annual reports. And our auditors will first of all make sure that that information is accurate in relation to the financial information they're auditing, but also apply some audit work to the decision making on voluntary severance packages as well, to make sure, for example, they're in line with the board's policies and any regulations that apply, that the governance around the decision making is appropriate, and they will test a sample of individual cases to make sure that they're being handled properly. The individual board's annual reports will contain more information than we've summarised here about the number and value of packages by range in quite a lot more detail. Angela and Gemma, do you want to add to that?
No, I mean,
sure that we have.
No, as Caroline said, this has essentially come from the board's annual accounts and has been through the audit process, so we don't have any supplementary information at the moment other than what's in our report. It would be in the board's annual accounts that would break it down a little bit further. And that's certainly for the difference in the average of the special boards. We could look to see that actually it was a different level of staff that were going last year compared to this year, to explain the difference in the average cost, exit cost for those special boards.
So you don't know whether this covers compromise agreements or
this covers
how they're
all
structured?
voluntary severance packages which are agreed. Some of those we understand are covered by compromise agreements, but we haven't separated those out within this.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much for that. I wonder if I can just pursue a couple more questions. Mary Scanlon and it is only a couple, there may be supplementaries to the couple, but they are only a couple. Mary Scanlon pursued the issue of the maintenance backlog with you, and I wonder if my memory is correct. I think about half of the maintenance backlog was ascribed to repairs that were at serious risk or catastrophic risk, and those were the descriptions used by the asset register rather than descriptions I'm applying to them. Can you confirm whether my memory is correct?
I can't. We had a similar question from Ms Scanlon and Mr Griffin, I think, and for the figure that we've reported here, which comes from the latest Scottish Government Condition Survey, we haven't got the figures to break it down for you. We agree that it's important that people do understand the seriousness and urgency of the investment that's required so they can plan the funding needed to respond to it.
Thank you. It may be something that the committee itself wants to look at. In terms of future pressures, because You rightly pointed to a number of future pressures that were currently identified, but the sums of money concerned weren't. In terms of pensions and pay, two areas in particular that will excite much interest at the moment. Have you made any assessment of the scale of the impact of that, or more appropriately, has the NHS made any assessment of the scale of the impact, and what provision have they taken for future budgets?
In terms of audit reporting, the report produced by my predecessor 12 months or so ago around Scotland's public finances did attempt to make an assessment of the likely pressures on both pay and pensions, and we can provide those figures through the committee if that would be helpful. Within the NHS, it's one of the things we're looking at as part of the work on workforce planning, because clearly an accurate assessment of what the cost of the current workforce would be is needed to measure what changes to the shape and size of the workforce are needed, and therefore how you get there. So it will be a big element in the piece of work that we've just kicked off.
And finally, Convener, future pressure in terms of spending on medicines. You rightly highlight that the percentage challenge is greater than the percentage board uplift, and therefore I'm wondering whether two things really. One, have the boards been taking measures in year to deal with that, because the prescribing pressures are happening now, not just at some point in the future? And will your report that we look forward to in January, February, I don't know when, actually highlight some of these key issues?
It's a lovely opportunity for me to leave you with a cliffhanger, that the report we're doing is throwing up some very interesting information, both about the scale of the pressures facing prescribing in general practice particularly, and about the way health boards and the Scottish Government is responding to them. But you won't expect me to steal my own thunder by telling you the answer just now.
Nina, thank you.
As Auditor General says, we'll leave things on a cliffhanger. Thank you very much. Thank you to Audit Scotland for your evidence, and the committee will now move into private session for our next item.